In the mid-20th century, kids were certain that the future would install itself any day now. Like a Windows update, you'd go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning in the space age. Every boy imagined the moment when cars would take to the sky, when friendly robots would wander the streets, when cities would become transparent, multi-level, glowing. Everyone believed humanity would pull the emergency brake on the old era and shoot straight into the stars. But the future never finished loading. Apparently the connection was too weak. It must be dropped halfway through. If you showed a child from the 1960s our 2025, he'd probably think someone handed him a defective copy of the future. He expected a radiant civilization, but instead he'd see the same houses, the same roads, the same tired faces, and the same streetlights flickering as if trying to apologize for their own exhaustion. He'd look around and ask, "Are you sure this is the future, and not just a long, dragging autumn?" And he'd be right. Here, in our so-called progress, the homeless warm themselves by trash bins. Drugs spread like mold on an old wall. Cities drown in garbage as if it were a new kind of building material. People wander like passengers who missed their stop, while the system sits somewhere above it all, shrugging, "Sorry folks, we're on lunch break." And in the developing world, it's not the future. It's the trailer for a disaster movie. The air tastes bitter. The seas are gone, replaced by liquid plastic mixed with water. Diseases seem to have been promoted and now work double shifts without days off. Humanity boils under the sun in a stew of heat, grime, and chaos, where everyone survives however they can, while civilization pretends everything is fine. Just hold on a bit longer, it'll get worse soon. Humanity's brainpower is being wasted in all the wrong places. We have millions of talented people, brilliant engineers, programmers, scientists, and where do they end up? Not designing rockets, curing diseases, or inventing new energy sources, but building algorithms to boost ad clicks, models that manipulate behavior, schemes for financial games, and virtual casinos disguised as video platforms. Instead of propulsion systems, we get advertising dashboards. Instead of medicine, sales optimization. Instead of breakthroughs for humanity, new tricks to lock people into just one more month of subscriptions. The global economy turns geniuses into digital sprinters, racing endlessly on a treadmill where the only prize is keeping a user glued to the screen for 3 extra seconds. Countries have stopped investing in fundamental science. Fundamental science is what creates the future 20 to 40 years down the line. The problem is that politicians think in 4-year cycles. 6 if they're lucky. If the results won't show up before the next election, the project doesn't matter. That's exactly why space exploration has turned into a show, why medicine is stalling, why biology develops in bursts instead of systematically, and why energy research is stuck in place. No one wants to pour billions into something that will only pay off long after they're gone. And that is a catastrophe. The economy is built for endless growth, but the planet isn't. We're trying to cram infinite economic expansion into a finite ecosystem. It's like playing Monopoly, where the money keeps increasing, but the board stays exactly the same. The elites shout, "Growth at any cost." But growth at any cost means cheaper labor, drained resources, pollution, crises every 8 to 12 years, and an ever-widening gap between rich and poor. Technology can't flourish in an environment where everything is measured by an inflamed hunger for profit. The crisis isn't an accident, it's a system. We didn't accidentally end up in a world where technology has stalled. The economy keeps wobbling and humanity walks in circles. We're here because the world is run by one simple logic. Keep everything more or less the same, as long as the money flows where it's supposed to. And it does work, For a very small group of people, for everyone else. That's what the crisis is. The social elevators are broken. The poor are sinking. The rich are flying. The middle class is disappearing. What elevators are we even talking about? We were left with a single staircase, and even that has been sealed off with concrete. There was a time when people said, study, work hard, stay persistent, and you'll rise. Today that line sounds like a joke from a bleak stand-up routine. The formula has changed. Born poor, get used to the view from below. The upper floors have been shut for years, guarded carefully, with a polite little sign posted on the door. No vacancies. Do not disturb. The rich live in their glass fortresses, breathing filtered air, eating sterilized food, walking on lawns trimmed with surgical precision. Meanwhile, the poor live in the real world, where every day feels like a battle for the right to exist without debt, panic, or humiliation. They fight for footing on ground that's constantly being pulled out from under them. The middle class, the very buffer that once kept society in balance, is evaporating. It used to be the backbone of civilization, people who could pay their bills, purchase goods, invest in their children's education, and avoid living paycheck to paycheck. Now that same middle class is being boiled like a frog, slowly, carefully, so it doesn't jump out. Everything rises at once: rent, mortgages, prices, taxes, and the crushing weight of personal debt. And with each turn of the screw, the gap widens between those who can afford anything and those who can barely afford to eat. The middle class is no longer a social layer. It's an endangered species, quietly added to the economic red list, fading out while the world pretends everything is still fine. Why is it like this? Because the rich benefit from having only two types of people, the very rich, meaning themselves, and the very poor, so that no one can compete with them or ask questions. The middle class is a threat. It has enough money and education to understand when it's being deceived. That's why it's being pushed out. Robots aren't the problem. The real problem lies elsewhere. Human labor is being replaced by algorithms, machines, and automated production lines. In theory, this should mean paradise, less work, more life, more creativity, more freedom. That's what automation was supposed to bring. Liberation, not displacement. But we don't live in theory, we live in overheated capitalism. And in this reality, the script is very different. Machines take over the work. The profits flow directly to the owners of those machines. The workers get tossed aside. The state shrugs helplessly, and the wealthy grow richer faster than the algorithm can update. And no, the people who lose their jobs are not suddenly going to turn into artists or creators. They can't even pay their rent. What kind of self-realization can you talk about when your wallet echoes back at you? How civilization should have developed if it had followed the natural logic of progress. First, let's get one thing straight. Humanity doesn't move through its stages by accident. We don't jump around chaotically. All of history is one long, stubborn struggle over the redistribution of property and freedom. And if you look at it honestly, without rose-colored glasses, it becomes obvious. We should have moved on to the next stage long ago. But we are being held back by those who cling to resources like cartoon dragons, squatting on piles of gold. The Neolithic era, when property was shared and people were free. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift to agriculture, gave humanity its first real leap forward. But the main point wasn't, oh wow, we learned how to grow wheat. The real significance was something else entirely. People had no private property in the modern sense. The land was communal, resources were shared, responsibility was collective. It was a model in which no one could buy up the air, the water, or someone else's future. Yes, life was harsh. Yes, there were problems. But the structure of society itself was healthy. No human being owned another. The ancient world, the era when people were turned into things. Then came the next stage, the rise of cities, the concentration of power, the first empires. And what did these so-called great civilizations do? Greece, Rome, Egypt. Every single one of them built its development on the same foundation: a human being property. A slave was a commodity, a tool, a replaceable part. The ancient world achieved progress at the price of human freedom. People didn't work for the future. They worked so the elite could build temples, roads, and machines of war. It was a dead-end path, but a powerful one, because for the first time, property gained absolute control over the human being. Medieval feudalism preserved the logic of the ancient world. It simply changed its costume. Now it wasn't a slave, but a serf. The essence was the same, only expressed more politely. Land became the main instrument of control. A person was bound to the soil, and the soil was bound to the owner. As for a social elevator, it didn't exist. It hadn't even been invented. The bourgeois revolutions, the first attempt to break free. The 19th century finally opened a crack in the system. A human being stopped being property. A human being became a person. The idea appeared that freedom is not a gift from above, but a right belonging to everyone. For the first time, the world had a real chance to move forward in the right direction. Private property stopped choking society. Science became an independent force. Education stopped being a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Labor gained value, and human rights became a norm instead of a philosopher's fantasy. This was the first step toward real progress, a moment when civilization could finally break the connection between wealth and power over people. The 20th century, the golden moment when we could have rewritten the rules. The 20th century was the era when humanity finally approached the crossroads. Either build a world in which technology liberates the human being, or build a world in which technology serves power. And the first decades looked like a victory for freedom, universal literacy, medicine, workers' rights, social protections, mass science, a genuine technological explosion, the rise of the middle class, and a shared belief that the future belonged to everyone. It was the moment when the path of progress lay clearly in sight. Property, a tool; freedom, a goal; technology, an accelerator; the human being, a value. And if we had stayed on that course, we would now be living in a world where robots work and people live. How civilization should have continued. This is what the correct path of progress should have looked like. Not a fantasy, but the logical continuation of everything history had already set in motion. Technology was meant to free human beings from labor. If machines can produce, then the workday should shrink, income should be shared more fairly, and people should devote their time to creativity, learning, art, and exploring the world. Robots were never supposed to become rivals. They were meant to inherit the burdens of heavy, repetitive work, so that human life could finally expand beyond survival. At the same time, the human being, not capital, should have become the central value of civilization. History spent 10,000 years moving toward this, from communal Neolithic life to the emergence of human rights. The logic is straightforward. First, humans belonged to the land, then the land owned humans. Then, humans became free. The next step should have been obvious: humans themselves becoming the purpose of civilization, rather than an economic byproduct shelved somewhere between profit margins and quarterly reports. States should also have chosen to invest in fundamental science rather than systems of control. The proper direction for progress was clear: space exploration, medicine, biotechnology, energy research, education, ecological systems, and artificial intelligence, developed as a partner rather than a digital overseer. Civilization should have been building intellectual capital, not erecting electronic cages around its population. In the end, real progress is freedom, not capitalization. Humanity should have reached a world in which property no longer dictates a person's destiny, where technology grants us time instead of stealing it, and where society's wealth is measured not in yachts and skyscrapers, but in the number of people who can live, create, think, and push the world forward. History is pulling us toward that destination. The system, however, is pulling us in the opposite direction. In the USSR, there was a secret program to study the human brain, not out of curiosity, not for pure science, but because communism desperately needed to prove one thing, that all people are equal, not metaphorically, not morally, literally, in the structure of the brain. The logic was brutally simple. If all brains are the same, then there is no natural elite, no inborn differences, no real inequality, which means the system is right, which means the ideology works. So they started collecting brains, literally, the brains of party leaders, scientists, public figures, outstanding people. They sliced them into thousands of microscopic sections, examined them under microscopes, compared them, measured them, and searched for proof of the dogma. And that's where things got uncomfortable. The brains were different. Some had subfields, some didn't. Some had unusually developed structures, others barely had them. There was no single, standard brain. So part of that information quietly disappeared, because when reality argues with ideology, ideology doesn't back down. Reality gets ignored. And this isn't really a story about the USSR. It's a story about how any system is afraid to admit that people are not equal in brain structure, even when it loudly claims otherwise. Let's drop the illusions. The brain is not a shining engine of progress. It's a lazy, horny, poorly controlled piece of biology that wants three things its entire life: to eat, to sleep, and to reproduce. And once it's fed, rested, and satisfied, a fourth program kicks in: dominance. In plain terms, showing off, proving to the group that you're better. That's why economics, advertising, and civilization in general manipulate us so easily. Shiny white gadgets aren't white because it's practical. They're white because the brain wants to glow in front of the tribe. A black one won't stand out. What's the point? These are instincts, and the brain loves them. Actual thinking, inventing new things, digging into math, understanding how the universe works. The brain hates that. There's no immediate reward, no meat, no offspring. Biology doesn't pay for it. Here's a slap in the face for a lot of smart people. Reading, counting, playing chess. None of that automatically means intelligence. Insects can count and memorize patterns. Chess is mostly memory and brute force calculation. Combinatorics, not creativity. That's why computers crushed humans in checkers almost instantly, and then in chess. Machines are great at memory and calculation. Real creativity is rare, expensive, and energy hungry, and the brain avoids it whenever possible. There is a popular myth that the human brain stopped evolving around 100,000 years ago. That's simply not true. The brain is still evolving, sometimes shockingly fast. The problem is that it's not evolving toward wisdom or depth. It's evolving toward what benefits the population and the social system, and sometimes that means going backward. Our ancient ancestors lived in near-paradise conditions. East Africa wasn't a desert. It was jungles, wetlands, protein-rich environments, fruits everywhere, and relatively low danger. And what happens to any creature in paradise? It doesn't start composing symphonies or building rockets. It does exactly what modern billionaires do when all problems are solved. Reproduce, compete, and display status. Yachts, jets, mansions, smart homes. That's not intelligence. That's baboon hierarchy with Wi-Fi. For about 10 million years, selection was almost entirely sexual and social. No survival pressure, no real danger. As a result, the brain didn't grow as a tool of understanding. It grew as an add-on to sexual instincts and social games. Evolution played a brutal joke. Our intellect grew out of systems designed to serve instincts. Climate changed. It got colder, drier. Food became scarce. Suddenly you're not king of the jungle anymore. No claws, no fangs, no armor, just a weak, upright body. About 90% of those paradise creatures died. The survivors weren't enlightened. They just had no choice. They started using the only thing left, the brain. The real breakthrough wasn't wisdom. It was learning to share food with non-relatives. That's huge. Animals hate sharing. Try taking a bone from a dog, even one you fed yourself. Humans had to suppress aggression for the group to survive. That required braking systems, frontal lobes. These aren't genius centers. They're biological brakes that stop the group from tearing itself apart. Only later did humans start using those brakes for thinking. Here's the uncomfortable part. Ancient migrations weren't heroic adventures. They worked like this. A stable group forms, and problematic individuals accumulate. Two types, the overly aggressive and the overly smart. Both destabilized the group. What happened to them? Today we'd isolate or institutionalize them. Back then they were expelled or eaten, mostly expelled. Those expelled individuals moved into new environments, adapted faster than others, and formed new populations. Stability, conflict, expulsion, migration, over and over again. As long as there was somewhere to go, brain evolution accelerated. When Homo sapiens dominated and competitors disappeared, life became mostly social. Large groups, rules, cooperation, conformity. You don't need a 1700-gram brain for that. You need a brain that's convenient. So brain size started shrinking. This wasn't degeneration, it was social selection. We reproduced the normal, the safe, the average. The strange, the too smart, the too different get quietly pushed out. Not violently, just denied opportunities, support education. No conspiracy, just herd behavior. The lower the variability of a population, the more stable it becomes, and the dumber, because development requires diversity, and society hates diversity. It fears it. So we isolate criminals rightly. But we also suppress the highly intelligent and unconventional, because they destabilize the system. And then we wonder why science stagnates, why creators are rare, why the world is full of managers of normality, instead of people who actually move things forward. Lenin's role in history is colossal. Whether someone likes it or not is irrelevant. There's no escaping that fact. Not because of monuments, slogans, or mythology, but because he was the first person on this planet to seriously attempt something no one before him had even dared to try. To replace blind biological human evolution with a conscious artificial selection of the brain. Not in theory, not in philosophical discussions, but at the scale of an entire country, and in intention, the entire planet. Lenin is uncomfortable not because of what he said, but because of what he tried to do. He didn't just criticize the old order. He attempted to rewire the mechanism by which people rise, survive, and reproduce within society. That's a level of interference most systems never forgive. Before that, life under the emperor followed a simple and stupid rule. If you were born into the right family, you were the elite. Aristocracy, nobility, boyars, merchants, estates, same essence. Family ties, inheritance, money. Pure biology, reproduction, dominance, appropriation. Lenin tried to break this principle, not cosmetically, fundamentally. That's a level of interference most systems never forgive. He started from a simple and very dangerous idea. If a human has a brain capable of doing something beyond eating, sex, and power, then selection should be based not on origin, but on ability. That was the real core of the entire project. Not slogans, not red flags, but a new type of human selection. Yes, it was dirty. Yes, there was blood. And Felix Dzerzhinsky was not a philosopher. He was the enforcer of that selection. But that doesn't change the essence of the process. The lesson is brutal and simple. Societies don't collapse from lack of ideas. They collapse from fear of objective selection. The moment you start measuring real differences, the comfortable hierarchy begins to crack. And that's why this topic is still radioactive. To start a new artificial selection, two things had to be done. First, remove those who lived purely by biology, reproducing, accumulating, appropriating, and nothing else. Second, find the capable. But how do you find capable people when education is a privilege of the few? The answer was obvious and terrifying to the old elites. Mass education, universal literacy, expansion of schools, access to knowledge not by birth, but by fact. In parallel, medicine, a medic in every village, medical schools even during the Civil War, reducing mortality so people could live long enough for their abilities to even have a chance to show up. And it worked. People who would otherwise have died early or remained invisible started to rise. The smartest, the most capable. That's why the Soviet technological leap happened. Industrialization in 10 years that took Europe 100. Ability-based selection plus education and medicine produced a real effect. The country took off. Lenin's attempt wasn't the end of the story. It was the first draft. The tools are only now becoming possible. And that's exactly why the conversation keeps getting buried. Because the next version wouldn't be ideological. It would be technical. And that scares people far more. But then the problem started. The first problem was short range. The system lasted only 3 generations. The second problem was lack of objectivity. After Stalin, the communists never managed to abandon selection based on ideological loyalty. They selected the correct, not the intelligent, and then acted surprised when loyal idiots failed to produce a smart system. Socialism didn't collapse because of economics or external enemies. It collapsed because it overestimated the cortex and underestimated the limbic system. The system tried to rely on reason and collective responsibility, but in the end it lost to basic brain biology. Instincts of dominance, kinship, and personal gain quietly and methodically took control. If tomographic tools with micron-level resolution had existed back then, if it had been possible to objectively study the living brain, history might have gone very differently. But that didn't exist, and the absence of objective selection led to the inevitable collapse in the 1980s. Now comes the second part of the story, the one discussed even less. Those who came to power were not just reformers, they were hardcore materialists. People who genuinely wanted to understand what consciousness is and where it comes from. And they went all the way. After Lenin's death, a decision was made to study his brain, not symbolically, literally. The world's best specialists were invited, including Oskar Vogt, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, a man with cutting-edge histological technologies. The Brain Institute was created in Moscow. Hundreds of brains from people of different nationalities were collected. Comparative studies began. The idea was simple and naive: to find cells of genius. Of course, no such cells were found. That was a dead-end idea of the early 20th century. But something far more important happened in the process. Soviet neurobiologists, in particular Ivan Filimonov, proved a fact that caused real heartburn among fascists. Individual variability of the brain outweighs any racial or ethnic differences. People are fundamentally different in brain structure, and this is measurable, objective, morphological. Moreover, a method was developed to compare people using objective neuroanatomical criteria. Yes, only post-mortem, but the foundation was laid. The tool existed. It was sharpened, but never implemented. Because the moment objective brain-based selection appears, the entire familiar power structure collapses: family ties, money, loyalty. And that is exactly what people without any outstanding abilities fear most. So, no matter how much one wants to simplify history into a caricature, the fact remains: an attempt to replace biological human evolution with rational artificial selection did occur. It almost worked, but failed due to the lack of objective tools. And whether you like it or not, that makes Lenin's role in history truly colossal. Let's clarify this from the start. Socialism itself is not a mistake. More than that, socialism is the logical next stage after capitalism. Socialism didn't come from compassion, and it didn't come from morality. It emerged as an attempt to break hereditary selection. Its core idea was correct: ability matters more than origin. The problem was elsewhere. Socialism didn't understand what abilities actually are at the biological level. It tried to measure them through ideology, loyalty, behavior, declarations. But those aren't abilities. Those are masks. Socialism aimed for equality. But equality of conditions is not the same as equality of brains. And that's exactly where the system started to break. Capitalism is a system of growth, accumulation, and selection by wallet. It works well at the beginning, when you need to rapidly scale production and technology, but it has a ceiling, and we've already hit it. Today, capitalism isn't developing, it's degenerating. It no longer selects for efficiency or thinking. It selects for ownership. It rewards not intelligence or the ability to create, but access to resources, loyalty to the system, and inherited positions. Money stopped being the result. It became the entry ticket. Access to education goes through your wallet. Access to power goes through origin. Access to the future goes through connections. That means selection is no longer based on the brain, but on birth. A system like that doesn't strengthen intelligence. It suppresses it, because intelligence is dangerous to stable hierarchies. The ending is always the same: impoverishment of the population, destruction of the middle class, total control, scores, algorithms, digital caste systems. A global concentration camp without barbed wire, where behavior is regulated by numbers and the majority of people are reduced to manageable biomass. Socialism didn't collapse because the idea was wrong. It collapsed because it was implemented without understanding the biology of the brain. The core mistake of past socialism was the ban on real brain research. The complete ignorance of how societies self-organize based on the structure of the human nervous system. And now comes the key thesis, the one that gives every ideologue instant heartburn. Individual variability of the brain outweighs any racial, ethnic, or social differences. People are not equal in brain structure. They never were, and they never will be. But, and this is critical, this is not a justification for elites, races, classes, or inherited privilege. It means something else entirely. Selection must not be based on origin, money, or loyalty, but on objective neurobiological characteristics. That's the key point almost no one understands. The moment socialism came close to real brain research, the moment it approached objective measurement, bans appeared, taboos, fear. Why? Because the brain is objective, measurable, independent of ideology. And that is lethal to any form of power. So the result was predictable. Research was shut down, objective criteria were replaced with correctness, and socialism lost, not ideologically, but technically. Why does equality without accounting for the brain lead to dictatorship? Because the moment a society declares everyone is equal in ability, it is forced to ban differences. And once differences are banned, there's only one tool left: control, unification, suppression. That's how dictatorship is born. Here's the paradox. The louder equality is proclaimed, the harder reality has to be crushed. Reality doesn't care about slogans. Brains are different anyway. And if you refuse to acknowledge that difference, you don't eliminate it, you just start policing it. That's why dictatorship kept emerging after socialism. Not because people were evil, but because the biology of the brain was ignored. Past socialism tried to select by ideology. Capitalism selects by money. Both are dead ends. The next step is selection by the brain, not in some mystical sense, not by talent, charisma, or success stories, but by real, measurable parameters of brain structure and function. And yes, that's scary, because the moment this happens, everything people cling to collapses. Hereditary elites fall apart. Wallets stop mattering, loyalty becomes useless, and the option to just slip through disappears. That's why this idea triggers panic. But here's the hard truth. The only real chance humanity has right now is not to bury socialism, but to fix it. What does this mean in practice? Full legalization and active development of living brain research. No taboos, no ideology, no ethics for idiots that exist only to block progress. It means understanding how societies self-organize based on neurobiology, different brain types, different roles, different levels of responsibility. It means a global neurosorting program, not for repression, not for castes, but for correct distribution of functions inside society. In real terms, it comes down to something very simple. Not everyone should govern. Not everyone should make decisions. Not everyone should define the future. Those who can think should think. Those who can manage should manage. Those who can't should not imitate. This isn't cruelty. It's the only way to avoid either global extinction or total algorithmic control. Neurosorting sounds scary only to people who are used to hiding behind abstractions. So, to fix the situation, 3 things are required. First, full legalization of living brain research, without religious, ideological or moral hysteria. Second, a model of society based on brain self-organization, not on abstract rights, invented for the convenience of power. Third, a global neurosorting program, with transparent criteria, measurable parameters, and functional role assignment. But there's one crucial point. Everyone must operate at their own level of complexity. This is not discrimination, it's specialization, the same logic as in a living organism. The liver doesn't run the body, muscles don't think, neurons don't digest food, but together, the system works. Socialism was the first attempt, and it almost worked, but it didn't have the tools. Today, those tools are finally emerging, and now the question is no longer whether we like this idea or not. The real question is different. Do we want to survive as a species, or keep going extinct, repeating the same mistakes over and over again? If we don't introduce objective brain-based selection, one of two things will happen. Either we get a digital concentration camp of capitalism, social credit scores, behavioral control, algorithmic obedience, a hereditary elite at the top, and biomass on the bottom. Or we get yet another version of pseudo-socialism, slogans, ideology, moral theater, and managerial collapse all over again. There is no third option. The socialism of the future is not ideological. It is technical, built on brain biology, objective measurements, and an understanding of individual variability. Everything else is a guaranteed path to human extinction.